The streets of Rome smelled of smoke and fear. The marble city, proud and ancient, trembled beneath the boots of its own sons. In the distance, the echo of marching soldiers rolled like thunder down the Oppian Way. Dust rose in thick, choking clouds, and on the horizon, a crimson banner bearing the letters SPQR fluttered in the dying light. But this was no foreign army at the gates. This was Rome marching on Rome, and at its head rode a man whose cold blue eyes reflected both brilliance and madness. His name was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the first man in history to do the unthinkable, conquer his own republic. Before Caesar, before Augustus, there was Sulla. His story begins not with triumph, but humiliation, born into a once noble family that had long since faded into poverty. Sulla grew up with the bitterness of a man who remembered what his blood was supposed to mean. He roamed the streets of Rome dressed like a pauper, mingling with actors, thieves, and prostitutes. Yet beneath the rough laughter and wild nights there was calculation. He watched, he learned, he waited. Rome, at the time, was rotting from within. Corruption had eaten into the bones of the Senate, and the common people were restless. The Republic was powerful but fragile. It needed only a spark to ignite. That spark came in the form of a war far away, in the east, against a cunning king named Mithridates of Pontus. The Senate needed a general to lead the campaign. They had two choices. One was Gaius Marius, the hero of Rome, the man who had saved it from barbarian invasion, the darling of the masses. The other was Sulla, his former subordinate, cold, ambitious, unrelenting. The rivalry between them would tear Rome apart. Years earlier, under Marius's command, Sulla had proven himself in blood. He had taken the fortress of Jugurtha in Numidia through sheer cunning, ending a war that had dragged on for years. Marius had taken the glory, but Sulla had taken note. The old general might have been loved, but Sulla understood something deeper, the game of power. Power wasn't about love, it was about fear. By the time Mithridates slaughtered 80,000 Romans in Asia Minor, Sulla had already built his network, his legions, and his reputation. The Senate, desperate for order, gave him command, but Marius, proud and furious, conspired to take it away. In the streets, mobs loyal to Marius clashed with Sulla's supporters. Stones and blades met in the forum. Senators fled for their lives, and Sulla, betrayed, humiliated, cornered, made a decision that would change the course of history. He turned to his soldiers, the hardened veterans of the social war, men who owed him everything. He stood before them in the dust, cloak whipping in the wind, eyes like iron. He told them that their rights, their glory, their honor had been stolen, that Rome itself was under siege by corruption and chaos. And then, in a voice that cut through the roar of the crowd, he gave an order no Roman general had ever dared give before: march on Rome. The sound of those words seemed to shake the heavens. The legions obeyed. Iron, shod feet began to move in rhythm, shields glinting beneath the sun. As they advanced toward the eternal city, the Senate sent envoys pleading, warning him to stop. He ignored them. For Sulla, the Rubicon of morality had already been crossed long before Caesar ever would. When his troops entered Rome, chaos erupted. Citizens screamed and scattered, unable to believe what they were seeing. Rome's own defenders, its sacred legions, now fought each other in the streets. Temples burned. Blood ran down the marble steps of the Capitoline Hill. When the smoke cleared, Sulla stood victorious. The Senate trembled before him. He demanded that Marius and his allies be declared enemies of the state. Statues were torn down, names were carved into death lists, and for the first time in Roman history, the Republic had been conquered by one of its own. Yet Sulla was not satisfied. He had tasted power, but power without permanence is a fleeting shadow. He wanted to shape Rome, to carve it into something that reflected his vision of order, hierarchy, control. But Marius was not finished. The old general, exiled and enraged, fled to Africa. There, under the scorching sun, he plotted his return. Meanwhile, Sulla left for the east to wage war against Mithridates. As he departed, he left behind a city trembling in fear, but believing, hoping, that peace had been restored. They were wrong, for the true storm was still gathering. In the east, Sulla unleashed the fury of Rome. His campaign against Mithridates was brutal, methodical, and terrifying. He besieged cities, slaughtered rebels, and executed entire garrisons that dared to resist. The roads were lined with crosses, the fields soaked in blood. To his men he was a god of war, to his enemies a demon in human form. And yet, as Sulla's victories mounted, messages from Rome reached him, dark tidings of revolt. Marius had returned, old, frail, but burning with vengeance. He and his supporters stormed Rome once again, drowning it in blood. Senators were butchered, enemies hunted. The city fell into madness. By the time Sulla received word, the streets of Rome had become rivers of death. The Republic, once the pride of civilization, was devouring itself. Sulla knew what had to be done. He turned his armies around and began the long march back to Italy. His soldiers followed without hesitation, hardened by years of war, loyal to the man who had given them everything. As they crossed the Adriatic, thunder rolled over the sea. The gods themselves, it seemed, were watching. Rome awaited its conqueror's return and its reckoning. The man who had once been an outcast now carried the fate of the Republic on the edge of his sword. Italy shuddered beneath the iron march of returning legions. Villagers hid in their homes as the thunder of drums echoed through the valleys. Sulla had come back from the east, crowned by victory, his coffers swollen with spoils, his men drunk on conquest. But his heart was cold, colder than ever. Behind his calm, marble-like face burned a single purpose: vengeance. He had seen what Marius and his allies had done to his Rome: senators murdered in the streets, noble houses burned, corpses tossed into the Tiber like refuse. His friends, his supporters, all gone. Now Sulla would return the favor. The legions that landed in southern Italy were not the weary remnants of a campaign. They were war machines trained in the fires of Asia, their loyalty absolute. When Sulla spoke, they listened not as soldiers, but as disciples. He promised them land, wealth, and glory, and something darker, something no other commander dared promise: revenge. As his banners advanced north, the Italian countryside became a battlefield once again. Cities loyal to Marius were surrounded and razed. Prisoners were crucified by the thousands. Sulla offered mercy only to those who knelt, and death to everyone else. It was not a war for the Republic, it was a war for Rome's soul. The Marian forces, led now by the younger Gaius Marius and the consul Carbo, tried to rally their troops. But their courage faltered before the discipline of Sulla's veterans. Battle after battle, Sulla crushed them, at Mount Tifata, at Sacriportus, and finally near the walls of Rome itself. The Republic's final defenders broke and fled. The gates of the eternal city stood open. Once again, Sulla entered Rome under arms. Once again, the city held its breath. This time, there would be no illusions. Rome was his. He rode through the ruined streets in silence, his soldiers marching behind him, their armor streaked with blood and dust. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of rot. From the Forum to the Palatine Hill, all of Rome waited to see what he would do. And Sulla did not disappoint. His vengeance came not as chaos, but as order, cold, deliberate, calculated order. He issued lists. Names carved into wood and posted in the Forum. Men, women, nobles, equestrians. It didn't matter. Anyone whose name appeared was condemned. Their property seized, their families ruined, their lives erased. These were the proscriptions, a word that would become synonymous with terror. Rome became a hunting ground. Friends turned on each other for gold or survival. Informants prowled the streets, pointing fingers for reward money. At dawn, The heads of the executed were displayed on the rostra where once great orators had spoken. The city of law had become the city of death. Yet amidst the slaughter Sulla appeared serene. To him it was not cruelty, it was purification. Rome, he believed, had become diseased. The Senate corrupted, the people fickle, the traditions broken. He would cut away the rot and restore the old order, an order where the Senate ruled, where generals obeyed, and where the Republic could breathe again. But to save Rome, he first had to destroy it. His reforms were sweeping. He stripped the tribunes, the voice of the common people, of nearly all their power. He doubled the size of the Senate, filling it with his loyalists. He made laws that ensured no one could command an army without the Senate's consent. On paper, it looked like restoration. In practice, it was domination. Sulla had become dictator, not for months, not for a year, but indefinitely. Dictator for the reconstitution of the Republic. The decree read, a paradox written in blood. Yet even now, Sulla did not call himself king. He despised kings. He saw himself not as a tyrant, but as a savior, a man chosen by fate to repair what centuries of greed and chaos had broken. His enemies saw something else entirely, a man who had conquered Rome and made it kneel. In the grand halls of the Curia, senators sat in silence as Sulla spoke, his words echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling. He reminded them that it was he who had saved the state, that it was his armies, his victories, his will that had restored peace. They nodded, not from agreement, but from fear. The shadow of his authority hung over every marble column, every whispered conversation. And yet, despite his iron control, Sulla was haunted by visions of the men he'd killed, by the city he had mutilated to save. He began to withdraw, to drink more, to surround himself with sycophants and entertainers. The same wild streak from his youth returned, twisted by guilt and triumph. The man who had once commanded legions now spent his nights in lavish feasts, his laughter echoing through halls built with the gold of the dead. But outside the Republic trembled. The peace he had built was brittle, a farce aid masking the ruin beneath. The young, ambitious and hungry watched him closely. Among them a boy who had served under him, a boy named Julius Caesar. Sulla saw something dangerous in that youth's eyes, something familiar. He once said, "In that young Caesar there are many Mariuses." And he was right. For Caesar would one day walk the same path, cross the same lines, and bring down the Republic that Sulla had tried so desperately to save or control. But for now, Sulla stood alone, the undisputed master of Rome. The Senate obeyed, the people feared, the enemies fled. He had achieved everything a Roman could dream of. He had reshaped the world through sheer will. Yet power, like all things, comes with a cost. The end came not with rebellion or assassination, but with silence. Sulla, the conqueror of Rome, the dictator who had made and unmade lives with a word, began to fade. The man who had commanded legions and reshaped the Republic now walked through his gardens in solitude, his thoughts turning inward. The marble villas he had built echoed with laughter no longer. The scent of blood had given way to the scent of decay and wine. He was not yet old, but the weight of what he had done pressed upon him like a curse. The proscriptions, the purges, the endless executions, they haunted his dreams. He would wake in the night, drenched in sweat, hearing the cries of the condemned, seeing faces of men he'd once called friends staring from the dark. And yet he would rise, pour himself wine, and whisper that it was all necessary, that Rome demanded sacrifice, that history would understand. But history, as Sulla would learn, is never merciful. Despite the peace he claimed to have restored, unrest simmered in the provinces. The wounds of civil war festered. And among the young, the dream of vengeance was not dead. The men who had lost fathers, brothers, fortunes, they remembered. Rome's streets were quieter. Yes, but it was the silence of exhaustion, not harmony. The The dictator's word was law, but the hearts of men had already begun to drift beyond his reach. Then, one day, without warning, Sulla did something no one expected. He resigned. He called the Senate, announced his retirement, and laid down his powers. The same man who had conquered Rome walked away from it. The senators stared in disbelief, unsure whether to applaud or tremble. He dismissed his guards, disbanded his armies, and returned to his villa near Puteoli by the sea. There he lived not as a tyrant, but as a free man, writing, drinking, laughing with friends, and watching the sun set over the Bay of Naples. Some say he did it to show that his reforms had made Rome strong enough to survive without him. Others whisper he was simply tired of killing, tired of ruling, tired of the gods who demanded too much. But in truth, perhaps he knew that every man who takes too much from the Republic must eventually pay his due. Rome had become a mirror, reflecting back the ambition of its masters, and Sulla saw himself in it, and saw that what he had built was both magnificent and monstrous. His health began to fail, his once commanding voice grew hoarse. He suffered from ulcers that spread across his skin, eating at him like punishment from the divine. The man who had dealt death to thousands now felt it creeping slowly through his own flesh. Even then, his will remained unbroken. When servants fled from the sight of his decaying body, he mocked them for their weakness. When doctors refused to touch him, he laughed in their faces. He had faced entire nations in battle. What was pain to him now? Yet at night, when the torches burned low, he would stare into the darkness, his mind wandering back to the streets of Rome. The marches, the fire, the screams. He would see the faces of Marius, of his victims, of the men whose names he had written on the proscriptions. He would mutter to himself, as though arguing with ghosts. The neighbors said they could hear his voice through the walls, low and cold, as if he were still commanding legions in his dreams. And then, one evening, as a storm gathered over the bay, Sulla sat alone in his atrium. Thunder rolled over the sea like the drums of distant war. The old general smiled faintly. As if hearing an echo of the life he had once lived, he raised his cup of wine to the heavens and whispered, "No man has ever done more for the Republic." When dawn came, he was dead. The conqueror of Rome, the man who had defied the Senate, the laws, and the gods themselves, was gone. The people of Rome mourned him in uneasy silence. Some cursed his name, others wept. His funeral was a spectacle worthy of a king. Legions lined the streets as his body was carried to the field of Mars. Trumpets sounded, and the banners of his victories fluttered in the wind. His enemies were dead. His reforms, for a time, endured. But the republic he had claimed to save was already crumbling from within. In the years to come, new men would rise. Pompey, Crassus, Caesar, each taking a piece of Sulla's legacy, each learning from his ruthless example. Sulla had shown Rome a terrible truth, that power could be seized by force, that armies could rule politics, and that the republic's laws were only as strong as the men willing to defend them. He had broken every rule to save Rome, and in doing so had taught others how to break them better. When Caesar later crossed the Rubicon, when civil wars consumed the Republic once again, it was Sulla's shadow that guided them. His ghost lingered over every march, every coup, every dictator who claimed to restore order. In the centuries that followed, historians would argue about who he truly was. Was he a tyrant, a visionary, a savior, or a monster? Perhaps he was all of them. Perhaps Rome itself demanded such men, creatures forged in chaos, destined to destroy so that something new might rise. Sulla's name would fade, overshadowed by greater figures who came after. But the blueprint of his power remained, carved into the bones of Roman history. Every empire that rose from the ashes of the Republic carried a piece of his legacy. The Senate steps still remembered the echo of his boots. The stones of the Forum still whispered his name. and somewhere in the collective memory of Rome his laughter, cold, triumphant, and eternal, still echoes.